and welcome to Gradient Connect. Gradient Connect is a series of interviews conducted with key industry personalities. Joining us today is Mr. W A Wijewardena, the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Mr. Wijewardena, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Let's focus on the upcoming budget first. The government has said its main focus in the upcoming budget 2022 is to reduce the budget deficit. Given the current low tax revenue environment and increasing expenditures, do you think the government is in a position to tighten the fiscal deficit?
I think the Minister Basil Rajapaksa, when he presented the tax amnesty bill and the Securities and Exchange Commission new act in Parliament, he used a very appropriate parable for that. He said, Sri Lankans are like people who are licking a honeycomb when they are faced with the threat of three types of debts. In fact, at that time, the three types of debts were, number one was the declining foreign exchange situation in Sri Lanka. Number two was the mounting foreign debt situation. Number three was the pressure for exchange rate to depreciate. Since then, I think he's now facing not three types of debt, he's facing now six types of debts. In fact, there are three more debts have been added to the list. We are facing the problem of government revenue falling to a very critically low level. Number two, we are having the threat of not having enough foods for people. Number three is the inability of Sri Lanka to import the essential items like fuel, medicines, food items and fertilizers and so forth. So therefore, it is actually a situation where the Sri Lankans are facing six types of debts, and therefore they cannot, start, licking the honeycomb, and they have to face the situation realistically. In that context, I think the government may not be able to offer the popular type of budget which all other governments since independence had offered to Sri Lankans. So this time the budget may be different, and that is why Dr. Jayasundara, Secretary to the President, and the Mr. Artigala, Secretary Minister of Finance, they had very vociferously, they had said this budget would be different from the previous conventional budgets. So we have to expect the worst in the budget. But of course, if it happens, with sincerity, the government would be able to go through it, and it will be able to offer us a long-term solution to Sri Lanka's ailing economic problems.
How likely are the expected dollar inflows to materialize? We are anticipating a credit line of about $3.6 billion from Oman and $500 million from India. What do you think?
Well, of course, now this was announced by Governor Ajitnath Cabral when he presented the 6-month roadmap on the 1st of October this year. But of course, in the opinion of many outside observers, this is just a wish list. And so far, now we have actually passed 1 month after he has made this presentation, we find none of the expectations that he had about the inflow of foreign exchange to Sri Lanka had materialized. And as a result, our situation has become worsened. That's why I said we are facing a new problem of a debt of the mounting the losing foreign exchange position, and in fact, to the advantage of the government and also the government policymakers, the Sri Lanka's net foreign asset position in Sri Lanka has become negative even in the case of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Now, this is the first time since 1977 Central Bank's net foreign asset position has become negative, and it was negative to the extent of $400 million in August. At the end of September, this has gone up to $790 million, and it is on the increase. So what it means is that the expected foreign exchange inflows to the country by Governor Ajitnath Cabral had not materialized so far. So we have to wait for a good day for it to materialize.
In this backdrop, Sri Lanka has a debt payment of about $2.5 billion due in January and July next year. In the backdrop of low dollar reserves, reducing worker remittances, declining tourism industry earnings, and some of the import constraints to be relaxed in the couple of months. How is the government going to pay off these?
Well, I will have to correct you. The actual obligations falling on Sri Lanka with respect to the repayment of the principal and payment of interest is not $2.5 billion US. Sri Lanka, in addition to the borrowings by the central government, the private sector also has borrowed sufficient amount, and the total debt obligations falling on Sri Lanka within the next 12-month period is about $7.6 billion US. So that includes the debt contracted by the central government, as well as the debt contracted by private companies, as well as commercial banks and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Now, these are all our national debt, and we have to repay within the next 12-month period the 7.6 billion amounting to the repayment of principal and the payment of interest. For that purpose, as I mentioned to you, the net foreign assets of the central bank has become negative now to the extent of $790 million US as at the end of September, and it is on the increase. And as a result, unless we get a mega inflow of foreign exchange to Sri Lanka amounting to more than $6 to $7 billion US within the next 12-month time period, Sri Lanka is likely to default not only the debt contracted by the central government, but also the debt contracted by the private sector. Because as Sri Lankans, we are obliged to repay both these types of debt. And as a result, we cannot just ignore the private sector debt in Sri Lanka, because many of the Latin American countries which fell into this debt trap, they had fallen into debt trap not on account of the debt of the government, but on account of the debt of the private sector. Now, in this case, the problem is the private sector companies maybe have rupee funds to buy US dollars. But Sri Lanka doesn't have US dollars to give them, so that they cannot repay. The problem of the government is, I think, it's a compounded one. Government of Sri Lanka doesn't have rupees, nor does it have dollars. So we are in a very precarious situation. And that is why many of the outside independent economic analysts had advised the Minister Basil Rajapaksa to go to IMF, get a bailout package from IMF, and it might help government of Sri Lanka to ensure the inflow of the expected foreign exchange balances to the country.
What are your thoughts on the Port City project, about its contribution to the GDP?
Well, this is actually, again, like our tourism sector, this has been overestimated. Many people don't realize the fact that Port City is an independent economic zone carved out of Sri Lanka, and it is operating independently of the rest of the economy. The currency that will be used in the port city will be foreign currencies, specifically US dollar. And the companies that would come to the port city would bring in US dollars, and they will pay salaries in US dollars, and they will have to have rupee funds only in order to pay certain local payments, like, the payment for utilities, payment for water, payment for electricity, and so forth. And the companies will not operate their accounts in any of the local banks, and as a result, the foreign exchange that is to come to the port city will not be the foreign exchange earnings of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, because these foreign exchange balances would be maintained in foreign countries, and as a result, they will just operate. I have actually compared it to a ship which has been brought to Sri Lanka and anchored in the waters of Sri Lanka. And they may be doing business with the rest of the people, as well as so many local agents. And even when they do business with the local agents will have to pay in dollars, and they will earn money, and they will take that money out. So it will generate a revenue for the government of Sri Lanka. Only the rent the government would be getting for providing the logistical facilities, plus the other services that they might buy from the rest of the economy, like, as I mentioned, water, electricity, and so forth. Even for electricity, they may not be depending on the Ceylon Electricity Board, or even the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation for the fuel requirements, they will have their own the electricity development and electricity generation, and also the storage of the fuel. Now, this is similar to most of these island tourist resorts in the Maldives. And all these island tourist resorts, they have their own electricity generation, they have their own water purification system, they have their own garbage disposal system, and it is just like, outside. So the Maldivian government gets only the tax revenue arising out of the sale of the accommodation to tourists who would be residing on those tourist resorts. Same thing with Sri Lanka, and our only gain out of the port city would be the rent income for the government, as well as the rupee earnings by certain local suppliers who would be selling services to them. Even the local people who are employed there will be paid in US dollars, and as a result, those people may be maintaining their accounts in foreign countries. So we cannot expect that much of an inflow into the rest of the Sri Lankan economy as a result of this port city project.
Okay. Let's look at inflation. Currently, the country is experiencing a supply-driven inflation, which is probably the most negative form of inflation an economy can face. High inflation is also getting embedded into long-term instruments. What are the implications we can look forward to?
Look, there again, I'll have to correct you, because it is not a supply-driven inflation that we have. We have a demand-driven inflation, because the government of Sri Lanka, as I have mentioned earlier, had lost the revenue base because of the attractive tax incentives that it had given to the income taxpayers and the value-added taxpayers. As a result, the drop in the government revenue in year 2020 had been, compared to the previous year, about 516 billion Sri Lanka rupees. The very same amount will be lost by the government in year 2021 also. If you look at 2022, the potential government revenue, if they had the tax system which had prevailed prior to 2019, they could have earned about 2.3 billion Sri Lanka rupees, 2 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. But as it is, the government may be getting at most 1,400 billion. So there's a big gap. This big gap had been filled by the government of Sri Lanka by borrowing from the banking sector, including the commercial banks and also the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And that has actually led to a phenomenal increase in the total money supply of the country. If you take the figures, because the figures are available only up to the end of August, if you take the period from January 2020 to end of August 2021, the 20-month period, the total money stock in the country had increased by 2.9 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. And this has been caused by the government's borrowings amounting to 3.3 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. And as a result, the people have money in their hands. But there are no goods available because the aggregate demand has increased. There is no increase in the aggregate supply. So as a result, prices are going up. And already the signs of the increase in the prices had been shown, because end of October, you would have noted the Colombo Consumer Price Index, which is again an underestimate of the prevailing inflation rate in Sri Lanka, had gone up by 7.6%. And in the months to come, this will accelerate. And it is not a supply-driven inflation, as many people believe. It's actually a demand-driven inflation. The demand has been driven by the government of Sri Lanka by getting the central bank to print more money. And that has been based on some economic monetary theory known as the modern monetary theory, which is actually advocated by some breakaway group. It's a very small number of breakaway group of mainstream economists. And unfortunately for us, the central bank governor who just left the position in September this year had embraced this modern monetary theory, and he had been able to prevail upon the policymakers in the government also to accept it. Now, I think I have seen Governor Ajit Cabral is one by one, he's dismantling the modern monetary theory, the shadow that had prevailed in the central bank. And you have noted he had been actually he had allowed the interest rates on treasury bills to go up, and he has actually taken out the all of the price controls that had been introduced. And there are certain other things that he has to do. And once he has done all these, completed all these things, we may be able to, I think, go back to a sound macroeconomic stabilization program for Sri Lanka.
What is your growth outlook for the country in the short term and the long term?
You have noted year 2021, the central bank had earlier projected 5.5%, but now they have downgraded it to 4.5%. IMF has put us at 3%. Fitch rating has put us 3.3%. Independent economists, they think that our growth rate will be either zero or pretty much close to zero at around 2% in 2021. And because of the disruption to supply chain locally as well as the globally, Sri Lanka will not be able to come back to its previous growth rates till about, say, 2025. And all Sri Lankans will have to live with this for the next 2 to 3 year time period, in my view.
Mr. Wijewardena, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your valuable insights. Until we see you again next week with another interesting interview, stay safe.